Imagine standing on a stone wall in the freezing rain, hundreds of miles from home, surrounded by people who don't speak your language, staring into a fog-choked wilderness where painted warriors want to kill you. You haven't had a decent meal in weeks. Your boots are falling apart. And someone has scratched into the latrine wall, and I am not making this up. Quote, I have sat here and pushed out everything I could. That's not Castle Black. That's not the Night's Watch. That is a real Roman soldier stationed on Hadrian's wall almost 2,000 years ago. And honestly, his life might have been worse than Jon Snow's. Because at least Jon Snow had direwolves. These guys just had dysentery, bad wine, and an empire that was slowly forgetting they existed. Today we're comparing the most famous fictional border guard in pop culture history with the real men who inspired him. And trust me, the truth is stranger, sadder, and somehow funnier than anything George R.R. Martin ever wrote. Let's get the obvious out of the way. George R.R. Martin has openly said that Hadrian's Wall inspired the wall in Game of Thrones. He visited the real wall in northern England, stood on top of it, looked north into Scotland, and imagined what it must have felt like for a Roman soldier to stand there, staring into the unknown, wondering what was out there in the dark. And then he made it 700 feet tall and made of ice, because he's George R.R. Martin, and subtlety was never really the goal. But the real Hadrian's Wall was impressive enough on its own terms. Construction began around 122 AD under Emperor Hadrian, and it stretched roughly 73 miles across the entire width of northern England, from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. It was up to 15 feet high in places, nearly 10 feet thick, and studded with mile castles, turrets, and full-sized forts. At its peak, somewhere between 9,000 and 15,000 soldiers manned the wall and its associated fortifications. That is a staggering commitment of manpower for what was, let's be honest, essentially the Roman Empire's way of saying, we're done expanding in this direction, thanks. And here's the thing that makes it eerily similar to the wall in Game of Thrones. This wasn't a glamorous posting. This wasn't Rome. This wasn't even Gaul. This was the absolute northern edge of the known civilized world, and the men sent there knew it. They were the Roman Empire's Night's Watch. Except nobody chose this. There was no dramatic oath by torchlight. You just got orders, packed your kit, marched for months, and ended up in the coldest, wettest, most miserable stretch of frontier the empire had to offer. So what was daily life actually like for a Roman frontier guard? Thanks to an extraordinary archaeological discovery at Vindolanda, one of the forts just south of the wall, we know more about these soldiers' lives than almost any other group in the ancient world. The Vindolanda tablets are thin sheets of wood with ink writing on them, basically the Roman equivalent of post-it notes. And they survived in the oxygen-free mud for nearly 2,000 years. And they are absolutely fascinating. We have personal letters, shopping lists, military reports, birthday party invitations. One of the most famous tablets is a letter from a soldier begging someone back home to send him socks, underpants, and sandals because he is freezing. Another is a birthday invitation from one officer's wife to another, which is one of the earliest known examples of a woman's handwriting in Latin. These weren't faceless legionaries. They were real people with real complaints, real friendships, and real desperation for warm clothing. The soldiers stationed on Hadrian's Wall came from all over the empire. We have records of units from Spain, from the Rhineland, from what is now Belgium, from North Africa, even from Syria. Imagine being a Syrian auxiliary soldier raised in the baking heat of the eastern Mediterranean, and suddenly finding yourself on a rain-lashed wall in northern England guarding against people who paint themselves blue. The culture shock must have been absolutely devastating. Their diet was monotonous. Grain, some meat when they could get it, beer instead of wine because grapes don't exactly thrive in Northumberland, and whatever they could trade for with local settlements. In the Night's Watch, the men of Castle Black eat salt beef, hard bread, and onion soup. The Roman frontier guards ate wheat porridge, bacon fat, and sour wine when they were lucky. Neither menu is winning any awards, and just like the Night's Watch, these soldiers dealt with crushing, soul-destroying boredom. Most days, nothing happened. You patrolled, you maintained the wall, you stood watch, you wrote reports about standing watch. You watched the fog roll in. You watched the fog roll out. You scratched rude words into stone because there was literally nothing else to do. The graffiti we found at Roman military sites is spectacularly profane and deeply human. Soldiers carved complaints, insults, boasts, and anatomically creative drawings into every available surface. Some things never change. Now, in Game of Thrones, the threat beyond the wall is the wildlings, and eventually the White Walkers. The Romans didn't have ice zombies, but what they did have was the Picts. And to a Roman soldier from southern Europe, the Picts might as well have been supernatural. The name Pict likely comes from the Latin picti, meaning painted ones. Roman writers described the people north of the wall as fierce, tattooed or painted warriors who fought with terrifying aggression. Cassius Dio wrote about the Caledonians and Maeatai, describing people who lived in tents and went without shoes, who endured the cold and hunger, who could hide in swamps for days, with only their heads above water. Whether or not that was exaggerated, and it almost certainly was, imagine reading that report when you've just arrived at your new posting. The comparison to the wildlings is almost too perfect. The people beyond the wall in Game of Thrones are portrayed as fierce, free, and ungovernable. They refuse to kneel. They raid south. They live in a harsh landscape that would kill softer people. The Picts were remarkably similar in how the Romans perceived them. To Rome, these were people who had rejected civilization, who lived in the wild north, who could strike without warning and vanish back into the hills and forests. And the wall itself served a similar psychological purpose. It wasn't just a military barrier, it was a statement. On this side, civilization. On that side, chaos. Us and them, the known and the unknown. Both walls, fictional and real, were as much about defining identity as they were about actual defense. Here's where things get genuinely weird and wonderful. The religious life on Hadrian's wall was absolutely wild. Because soldiers came from every corner of the empire, they brought their gods with them. At various sites along the wall, archaeologists have found evidence of worship of Mithras, the Persian mystery god popular with soldiers, Jupiter, obviously, local Celtic deities, a Germanic goddess called Garmungabis, even evidence of what might be Syrian religious practices. One of my favorite discoveries is the Temple of Mithras at Corobra, right near the wall. Mithraism was a secretive, initiation-based cult popular among Roman soldiers, involving ritual meals, grades of initiation, and the symbolic slaying of a bull. Picture this: Roman soldiers in northern England gathering in a dark underground temple, performing secret rituals to a Persian god, while outside the wind howls and the Picts sharpen their spears. That is peak ancient weirdness, and I love it. In Game of Thrones, the Night's Watch has largely abandoned religion. There's a small sept and a godswood at Castle Black, but faith takes a back seat to survival. The real Hadrian's Wall was the opposite. Religion was everywhere, precisely because life was so hard. When you're cold, scared, bored, and far from home, you pray. You pray to every god you can think of. And if your buddy from Syria has a god you haven't tried yet, well, why not hedge your bets? There are also curse tablets. Soldiers would inscribe lead tablets with curses aimed at people who wronged them, thieves who stole their cloaks, rivals in love, enemies in the ranks, and bury them as offerings. One recovered tablet essentially asks the gods to make a thief's life miserable until the stolen goods are returned. It is petty and perfect, and so incredibly human. The deepest parallel between the Night's Watch and the Roman frontier guards isn't the wall or the enemies or the cold. It's the forgetting. In Game of Thrones, the Night's Watch was once a noble institution, 8,000 years old, honored throughout the Seven Kingdoms. By the time we meet them, they're a skeleton crew of criminals and outcasts, begging for supplies, ignored by the crown, dismissed as irrelevant. Nobody in King's Landing cares about the wall anymore. The Roman frontier guards experienced almost exactly the same decline. In the early days of Hadrian's Wall, the garrison was well supplied, well organized, and connected to the vast machinery of Roman military logistics. But as the centuries wore on and the empire's attention shifted to other frontiers, other crises, other threats, the wall became a backwater. Supply lines grew longer and less reliable. Reinforcements became rarer. The distinction between soldiers and local civilians blurred as garrison troops married local women and their children grew up knowing nothing but the wall. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, The Roman military presence on Hadrian's Wall was fading. The last known Roman units were withdrawn around 410 AD, when Rome told Britain essentially, "You're on your own." Imagine that. Generations of soldiers had been born, lived, served, and died on that wall, and one day the empire just stopped answering their letters. The Night's Watch at least had the decency to decline slowly. The Roman frontier guards were simply abandoned. The stones of Hadrian's Wall still stand today. You can walk along them, touch them, see the marks left by the men who built and guarded them. You can visit Vindolanda and read the words of soldiers who lived and complained and shivered and prayed almost 2,000 years ago. You can stand where they stood and look north and feel, even for a moment, what it might have been like to be the last line of defense at the edge of the world. George R.R. Martin took that feeling and made it fantasy. But the reality didn't need dragons or white walkers to be extraordinary. It just needed ordinary men, far from home, doing their duty on a wall that the world was slowly forgetting. And maybe that's the most powerful parallel of all. The Night's Watch oath says, "I am the sword in the darkness, the watcher on the walls." The Roman soldiers on Hadrian's Wall never had words that poetic. They had cold feet, stolen cloaks, rude graffiti, and a stubborn refusal to abandon their post even when their empire abandoned them. Somehow, that's even more heroic. If you enjoyed this journey along the wall, both walls, smash that like button. Subscribe if you want more videos where we dig into the real history behind your favorite fiction. And drop a comment telling me, would you rather serve in the Night's Watch or on Hadrian's Wall? Personally, I'm going wherever the socks are warmest. I'll see you in the next one.